civil rights activists gathered in Selma, Alabama to commemorate the 52nd anniversary of the March for Voting Rights for African Americans. But it was this statement by Alabama Secretary of State John Merrill at a nearby church service that grabbed the headlines.
Every eligible U.S. citizen that's a resident of Alabama is registered to vote and has a photo ID so they can participate. We made all 67 counties throughout the state of Alabama.
Merrill's statement on Alabama's voter ID hit a nerve with voting rights advocates who argue Alabama is one of many states engaging in voter suppression. Right now, we want to go to Skype from Alabama, and that is Secretary of State John Merrill. Secretary Merrill, welcome to TV1.
Good morning, Mr. Martin. It's great to be with you.
First and foremost, when it comes to this issue of voter fraud, what is the evidence of voter fraud in Alabama that caused you to say voter ID was important?
Well, Mr. Martin, one of the things that occurred when I was in the legislature was the introduction of a voter ID bill. And
when was that?
Excuse me?
When was that?
That was in 2011.
Okay.
I was a member of the legislature from 2010 to 2014. One of the things that I did when I was evaluating the merits of the bill was to determine whether or not there was actual evidence of voter ID or voter fraud. And there had been some incidences, but one of the things that was interesting to me is there had been no prosecution over the last decade or so. Now, since I have been the Secretary of State, one of the things that we've done, we implemented a program where any citizen could indicate their interest in making sure that alleged violations that had occurred or any infraction that had been introduced was reported to us. So we entered into agreement with the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency, Alabama Attorney General's office, and we established stopvoterfraudnow.com. So we have a way of receiving those reports, then we can make sure that they're properly processed and that they're evaluated. We've had 318 incidences that have been reported.
You had 318 folks, 318 different areas where people say there was voter fraud. How many prosecutions?
Yes, sir. So far, we have had 2 prosecutions that have occurred, and we've had 4 convictions since I've been the Secretary of State.
So you're telling me that when people say that hundreds of thousands of people are impacted by voter ID, so for instance, in Texas, that voter ID bill, 600,000 people, largely minorities, impacted by voter ID. When Texas filed their statement before the federal bench, they gave 12 examples in a decade. More than 25 million votes cast. They found 12. So
now, Martin, let me share this with you. I know Texas is real important. It's a real important state to the union, but it's not important to me today.
Well, no. Actually, the reason that's important because you've talked about voter fraud even in other states. You talked about voter fraud in New Hampshire when, in fact, the Republican governor, the Republican Secretary of State, they've said, we found no evidence of fraud. So you've actually talked about voter fraud in other states, not just Alabama.
Yes, sir. And one of the things that was introduced to me, and there's plenty of empirical data about the situation in New Hampshire, and I would refer you to the Heritage Foundation, who would be able to make all of that information available to you for your review. But the thing that we're concerned about is making sure that in Alabama, it's real easy to vote and real hard to cheat. And the thing that I was attempting to do at Brown Chapel Church was to ensure that all the people that were in attendance knew that anybody in Alabama that wants to have a photo ID that does not have one, we'll be happy to provide one to them at absolutely no cost.
But here's the piece, though. Again, but what this goes to is, you said the bill was introduced in 2011. All these voter ID bills all of a sudden came up after the election of President Barack Obama. At a National Association of Secretaries of State convention, this is what David Becker, Executive Director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, said, because they actually study this. There's a system of checks and balances in place. We all know in this room that if there were massive voter registration fraud, we would have seen large numbers of flagged records that didn't match DMV records or Social Security records, that we would have seen unusual levels of activity we hadn't seen before, that we would have seen large numbers of requests for out-of-state mail ballots that we hadn't seen before. You have experts who say your claims of this massive voter fraud is virtually non-existent.
Well, now, I have not made any claims about massive voter fraud. I've talked about specific instances that have been introduced to me either in our state or through empirical data. But I know one of the things that's been shared is about Alabama being a state that deals with voter suppression. And the thing I want you to know about what we've done in Alabama is that we've registered more voters than at any time in the history of the state. Since January the 19th, 2015 until today, we've registered more than 600,000 new voters in our state, which has led us to 3,340,000 total voters in the state, and that's the largest number in the history of Alabama. And we broke every record for participation in our primary with 1.25 million on March the 1st, 2016, and then again on the general election day, November the 8th, with more than 2.1 million voters participating, which are the largest numbers in the history of the state. So we don't see any evidence of voter suppression in Alabama. As a matter of fact, when we have had situations introduced to us where we've had constituents that are homebound and can't get out of their homes, and they can't go to the regular location that's open every day in their local county, or they can't go to where our mobile units go, we've actually been to their homes and given them photo IDs in their homes. And we want to do that because we feel like we're committed to ensuring that they can participate at the level they want.
Well, Secretary Merrill, you talked about how you have not talked about massive voter fraud, but that was the reason for the law. Republican lawmakers in Alabama said we're passing this law because of massive voter fraud to protect. So I'm trying to understand, if there was no evidence of massive voter fraud and that wasn't your argument, then why have the law?
The reason for my vote. It was not the reason for the majority of my colleagues' vote either. It was to preserve and protect the integrity and the credibility of the elections process. And that added another level of validation for people that wanted to participate. And that's one of the reasons why it was so important to me to make sure that people that did not have IDs because they didn't have driver's license or because they could not afford a non-driver ID, that we put a provision in the law that would allow us to give them an identification piece that they would not have to pay for. Now, the effort that we've made so far, Mr. Martin, in order to ensure that all citizens have an ID by actually going to all 67 counties every year since I've been the secretary, and to go to people's homes, proves our commitment to ensuring that we're doing everything we can to allow them to participate at the level they want to participate. Maybe it's just to vote, or maybe it's to run for office to help them.
Well, unfortunately, I'm out of time right now. We're going to continue the conversation again because, of course, there's a lawsuit against Alabama, and you're defending that will come up in September of this year. We'll be certainly covering that lawsuit right here on TV One. Thanks so much. Well, Bennett, I want to go back to our panel here. I want to give them an opportunity to talk about, real quick, the Merrill conversation there. One, all of these, first of all, we ain't fooling nobody. All of these voter ID laws all came out in full force after the election of President Obama.
Exactly.
There was no massive black turnout in North Carolina, in Alabama, and all these states, and they saw the writing on the wall, the demographic changes, and the Republicans said, no, we got to slow this thing down.
And their policy has become to try to stop people, make it harder for people to vote, and particularly in minority communities. It's not going to work. They're going to be overtaken by the numbers.
You know, listen, when I was listening to the Attorney General, I was thinking about Secretary of State, how they have created this issue of voter ID out of nothing.
Solution is such a problem.
Exactly. They've created it. He talked about empirical data, and the only data he could point to is, of course, the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the most conservative foundations in the country. But secondly, and most importantly...
No, he had data. 305 people called in.
But that was the second point I was going to make.
4 convictions.
Right, and they're putting time, money, and resources behind this. It simply makes no sense. But secondly, what's even more interesting is that the data itself is flawed, and that the data coming from the organizations that know this best match up with those percentages that you just identified.
So 3 quick things. First thing, he slandered Heritage because Heritage isn't throwing the New Hampshire data out there. Secondly, the question I would have asked him is, sir, you're a fiscal conservative. You know, I believe your colleagues are fiscal conservatives. Why are you wasting millions of dollars attacking black voting rights? The third thing I would have said is I would have came back with, okay, if there's massive voter fraud, you've been elected 2-3 times in the state. Your colleagues have been elected many times over. So you mean to tell me that your elections are now invalidated because of massive voter fraud? I mean,
But they try to clean it up, if I may. They try to clean it up by saying that we put in the legislation an effort to get more people signed up for these ID, and we make those provide for them. Republicans really believe that. But yet you've created the problem.
Right.
You're going to solve that problem by giving more access to voter ID.
They don't believe that. They know what they're doing.
Every person has sponsored voter ID legislation. If you believe that you have massive voter fraud in your state, resign, because your election probably was a fraud. If you have massive voter fraud, that doesn't exist.
The problem
It's
wasn't
just rhetoric.
voter fraud. The problem was Barack Obama's election.
But still,
And that scared the party a great deal. And once they got scared, they went to this instead of a change in policy.
And because they have majority of the legislatures, the governor's mansions, they've been able to pass it. Iowa House just passed a voter ID law.
Right.
Michigan is trying to pass one. They're all trying to pass it, and they also are trying to hurry up and do this because also by the Supreme Court invalidating pre-clearance from the Voting Rights Act and Congress refusing to put that authority back in, they also are now having reason to do so, and so that's the real
Iowa
deal.
has a racist Steve King problem.
Yeah, well, first of all, we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with that bigot tomorrow on the show. A peaceful protest turned deadly. 37-year-old black man was shot and killed by Baton Rouge police. His hands are in the air, and you still get shot by the cops.
Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead.
We're not going to let hate define us.
Race is a big part of this.
If truly all lives matter, then all lives need to matter equally.
What we require is action. What we require is accountability. We understand that black lives do matter, and we will keep focused on this issue.
NewsOne Now, every weekday morning at 7 on TV1.